Hello, you are now entering the infinite void. Hang on tight. We cannot save you now.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode. I'm your co-host Jacob.
And I'm your co-host Matty, and this week we're doing part 2 of our series on simulation theory, and I think we're going to be looking at sort of the technology and some more in-depth ideas of what the simulation could be.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's a good way to start it, because I think last week we kind of just broke the history down, what it was roughly, and I think it'd be good this week to kind of like go through and show like the listeners what we use simulations for, like the technology supporting it, the different kinds, just kind of like that stuff before we build on our kind of like final thoughts episode.
last week it was mainly history, wasn't it, and a bit of philosophy, so it'd be good to get into a bit more of the details about what simulations we have currently, and I think probably towards the end we might think about some more abstract technologies that could come along in the future, which would hopefully segue nicely into next week's episode, where we're going to give our own opinions on it.
Yeah. I think that sounds good. So we should probably kick this episode off with what is a computer simulation. Now, I couldn't figure out a way that I wanted to like word this, so I've been and found a pretty well written quote. So I thought I'd kick the episode off with that. But computer simulation, so it's the use of a computer to represent the dynamic response of one system by the behavior of another system modeled after it. A simulation uses a mathematical description or model of a real system in the form of a computer program. This model is composed of equations that duplicate the functional relationships within the real system. When the program is run, the resulting mathematical dynamics form an analog of behaviors of a real system with results presented in the form of data. So that's quite a big thing to...
It's very catchy.
Yeah.
That can be the title for this week.
Yeah. That's a great, yeah, that'll do some absolute damage to the algorithm. But yeah, basically it's kind of just the whole point of a computer simulation is to try and simulate many things, really, isn't it? It can be future events, it can be treatments, it can be relationships to do with how things interact with each other. It can be pretty much anything. And I think why they're so important as we're learning, the more computational power we're getting and stuff, as we're probably going to discuss with like standard computers and quantum computers and stuff like that. Obviously, the more you know, the more chance you have as a species to not make mistakes and be able to notice things that you might not have noticed before, or maybe aren't so obvious to you whilst you're working on something else. Because it's kind of like what we were talking about with AI as well. You know how I can't remember which episode it was, but we kind of discussed this idea of like, it's happening, and when it happens, it'll just happen. It won't be like you'll wake up and the whole world will be took over by robots. It'll just be too late for when everybody notices. And this is like something why computer simulations are good, because it allows you to like simulate said outcome to see if it has any pluses, if it has any negatives, to see how many of the simulations go a certain way, how many go this other certain ways, and try and figure out probabilities and stuff, which I think we discussed a little bit too in chaos theory, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and I think it just kind of makes sense. And it's funny because when we talk about simulation theory, like, as we're probably going to discuss some of these examples of where simulations are used, it would almost make sense to have a simulation of the universe. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Like we discussed last time, one of the sort of outcomes that Nick Bostrom described was it could be that we are able to produce simulations that we have no real desire to, or we don't allow ourselves to. And I think out of those sort of the trilemma that you put forward, that's probably the weakest argument to me, because they do seem to be so powerful and they have so many obvious uses.
Yeah.
So personally, I'd sort of just scratch that one away and say, well, that's obviously not true. Whether it seems like there'll be very, very obvious benefits to it and that we would want to do it anyway. But even if sort of most of humanity decided, oh, actually, no, for whatever reason, we're not going to run these simulations, there would almost certainly be some sort of breakaway group or sort of criminal or whatever that would just want to run these simulations, especially if the computing power got quite easy, that they could be done relatively easily. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of utility in a wide range of simulations, and even in my sort of personal life, the work that I do is, if you can simulate something rather than having to go out and actually do it, then you can A, save a lot of money and a lot of time, and B, get a lot of data more quickly than you probably otherwise would do. So, yeah, if you can simulate something, it's almost certain that you will want to simulate it. So,
I was just thinking, like, in line with like Eastern like mindsets and stuff. This idea of like, like living in the moment and like taking everything in. Like, I watched Soul on the weekend, the Disney Pixar film, so I'm on that hype at the moment. This whole idea of like just looking around and appreciating what the color of the wall is, and is it warm or is it cold in the room? Are you comfortable? Like all that kind of stuff. But thinking about that, like, I wonder if there is any civilizations in the universe that might have got to the technical capability of being able to simulate like life or society or the universe, and almost don't want to know what the outcome is because they like won't have any purpose then. Do you know what I mean? Because like, say if humans were like, oh, we can simulate the universe, and we did, would we allow that knowledge to be public to everyone? Because if we all knew what the purpose of the universe is, and it wasn't anything to do with our life or what we were doing or what we felt our little bit of contribution was, would society just kind of collapse in general? Because like if everybody knew the end, because it's like, when you get asked that question, like, oh, if you could find out how you were going to die, would you want to know? And some people are like, yeah, of course, because then I could stop it. And other people are like, no, because I'm going to spend my whole life worrying about it. Like, it's kind of the same. Like, if you could find out what the meaning is to reality, if it wasn't what you wanted for a meaning, would you just kind of like have to accept that you've got to carry on this existence in this meaning, or would you just do something else?
It's kind of like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If we ever found out what the meaning of life was, everything would just sort of disappear and be replaced by something even more complex. So, I think it's an interesting question. It's actually sort of tied up within simulation theory in that, if we ever did imagine if we were in a simulation, if we found out, would the simulation just end? Would people suddenly like just feel worthless, or would they sort of suddenly have this, oh, wow, this is life, we might as well get on with it kind of thing? So, yeah, I think it's interesting that you can look at it from an outside perspective as like, should we create simulations and what would that mean for society? But also this sort of, if we are in a simulation, what does that mean for society? And sort of some of the conclusions of those questions are the same in that they make us ask what is the point of anything, and what is the point of doing anything to try and affect stuff. So yeah, I think it's pretty, it gets quite deep, doesn't it? Quite quickly.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. I think it's one of those like thought experiments that, kind of like what we were saying last week. You've got no real way of testing or proving that you're in one. So like the possibilities are endless onto whether or not it is. And I can totally see how some people, if they like are quite easily swayed, or if they're having a weird week and they start noticing things, it's quite easy to like see that it could be. And then it's also quite easy to take a step back and be like, but it's also not, because this is my life and it's always been this way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's this sort of like big question of what it means to be human, and if you found out all of this simulated, would that change anything? I don't know.
Yeah.
It might be that if you found out everything was simulated, they go, "Oh no, they found out and just turn us off." So
maybe the whole point of the simulation is to create simulations. Maybe that's the goal. You just got to keep working towards making a simulation, and it just goes into like an endless paradox. But before we go off on a tangent of random philosophy, life existence questions, we should probably go through some examples that simulations get used in, because I think me and you've got a few different ones. So the first one that I found, which is kind of funny for the time that we live in, is responding to deadly pandemics.
Yeah.
And that made me laugh because it feels like whatever simulations we were running of how to deal with deadly pandemics, either they were just telling us that they were coming and we did absolutely nothing to prepare for them, or we didn't have very good data and we weren't aware of what was going to go down. But I think that's interesting. Did you ever used to play those games? I think there's like one on the iPhone, which was like the virus game. We had to like get it airborne and stuff.
Yeah, I love those.
Yeah, I enjoy this kind of games. I enjoy the ones where you have to like, it's kind of like Risk, but with military people. I think they're quite fun. But after pandemics, you've got stuff like healthcare. So there's loads of different simulations in healthcare. You've got like cancer treatment simulations. You've got like blood simulations. The ones where they get like the robot to do operations and they simulate like where it's going to go into, like which artery and vein and stuff like that. So I think in potential to like Medicare and pandemics and stuff like that, it has huge potential, because you're essentially, the great thing about simulations is it's essentially letting you trial it out in like a metaverse, aren't you really? You've got it's like a place you can go where there are no bad outcomes and you can kind of just simulate and see what happens. And I think when it comes to things like that, you're going to get big breakthroughs in like Medicare and stuff when you're simulating it.
Yeah, medicine in particular is a field where people don't like you doing very bad stuff intentionally to see the outcomes. So if you could try and minimize that sort of risk element, even if it's something quite sort of, it doesn't seem like there's a massive amount of risk. So just sort of general medicines and sort of care. I know there's been a big push in recent years, and it goes back to, I think quite a while ago, we discussed things like protein folding and using supercomputers to do that. There was a breakthrough in that quite recently. Even things like that, there's been this big push to try and better replicate proteins and body functions and stuff, so that we could get to a point where you've got a completely sort of perfect simulation of, say, the pancreas or the kidney or something, and you just artificially inject it with some drug that you've programmed up, pull it in and see what it does.
Yeah.
And if you can do that sort of first step in a simulation rather than on animals or on humans or whatever, then it's sort of like another tick. And if something goes terribly bad and there's obviously no real outcomes are bad because of that. So medicine in particular, I think, is a big one. And already over the last couple of years, sort of my impression of it is that we've got to a point where we can simulate at least sort of small things, and quite localized things very, very well. So
I was thinking about that actually. You know, like for instance, like Iron Man, for instance. You know, when he's like talking to Jarvis and he's like, "Hey Jarvis, can you simulate this?" And then you can like see it working out all the different variants, and then it pops up with a green tick, and it's like, this one is successful. Like, if we got to a point where we could simulate like most animals, and we could do the tests digitally to them to kind of find out if it's compatible or not. If we found it was compatible and like it was 100% like foolproof, it was going to be right, would it still be called animal testing? Because we'd know the outcome to it, And then would it still be ethically and morally okay to do because we know the outcome to it? Because I was thinking about that when I was like reading into a few of these ones today. I was like, because obviously sometimes with like animal testing, well, any kind of animal testing usually is quite bad. But would it be animal testing if we knew what the outcome was going to be because we tested on a digital copy of it?
So you mean like you've got like a rat or something, and you've already simulated it, and the results of the simulation say it's absolutely fine
To do
and
whatever you're going to do.
Yeah, and then you give it to the rat in real life
Yeah.
to check.
Yeah. Is that allowed in the future? That sounds like a grey area problem. Because it could be the same with humans too, right? Because if we get to a point one day where, because it kind of falls back into like our AI like discussion and stuff, like if we get to a point where we can like simulate a human, like it doesn't have to be conscious at this point. We've just got to be good at simulating like what a human has biologically and how it reacts to things. But if we could simulate a human and then you could go into this like program and run loads of different variants on this human until one was successful, then would it be considered the same thing? Like, would you just be able to then go to the human and be like, we've done 1 million trials on a digital human, it's 100% effective, here you go? Because like it would speed up a lot of things, but then when it comes to like animals and stuff, like would it, is that still ethically okay? Because it's not really testing if you know the answer, but should you do that?
I think I can see us getting to the point where the simulations are so good that we can go just from simulation to sort of early tests on humans, because nothing is ever risk-free. Even if stuff has been tested on animals and has been tested sort of extensively in real life, it's never completely risk-free.
Yeah.
And there is always a risk to it. If this will take sort of many, many years, but if, 1,000 drugs have been developed using simulations and all of the simulations matched up to the results seen in humans, and, initially there probably would be, and initially the simulations would be added as just the first step, and we'd still do the animal testing and then the early human trials. If the simulations match to the early human trials, then, in 99.9% of the cases, then there probably would be a case of, to be honest, just probably money. If we can cut out animal testing and sort of certain bits of human testing, if we can go just from a simulation to sort of preliminary human trials, and we could be 99.9% certain that it's good and it works, then I think ultimately it would be money that talks, and they'd be keen to just get the regulators to approve it. So
because like obviously like with the next one now, so like space exploration, they pretty much simulate all aspects of that, especially when it's like going into uncharted areas and like mining asteroids and landing on other planets and putting their rockets up and stuff. Like most of that's obviously simulated before you try it, and it's usually down to a pretty good like tier, isn't it? Like when you watch, even when you watch like the Perseverance Mars landing like a couple of weeks ago, like even the fact that you got to watch like the digital kind of like version of it and stuff.
yeah,
You'd think that if they can do it there, it would probably happen in like the biological sector too. But
I was reading a thing about this last week actually, about the sort of preparations that they're making for. I think Destin from Smarter Every Day. Yeah. I think he did a video a week or two back on sort of simulating landing on the moon, sort of human landings on the moon, and sort of way back with the Apollo mission there, that flying, they called it the flying bed, like that they used to sort of train the pilots for landing on the moon. And it was sort of this discussion about how now a lot of the training is done in simulators and stuff, and there's probably part of it is people wanting to do things properly in the old way, and part of it is like genuine concern and stuff that modern sort of astronauts and pilots aren't getting enough actual hands-on experience of flying stuff.
Yeah.
And it's very sort of simulator based. And there's this discussion of like, should we be doing something similar now? Because at the moment, NASA are sort of exploring, developing a new sort of test bed for pilots, and they've got this big. It's almost like a massive 3D printer, like a huge thing with like the model lander sort of suspended, and it can move around like a 3D printer arm when they're flying, sort of thing. They've developed this massive prototype for that. But this sort of wow, we need to get them time actually flying stuff, and how good and how close does the simulator get to that, so that we can reduce the risks of them actually flying stuff around. And like that old Apollo flying bed thing was just horrendous. It was just a jet engine strapped to you. It was almost impossible to fly. And I think Neil Armstrong had to eject from it once and ended up burning up one. It was destroyed. So sort of trying to weigh real world sort of hands-on flight time with reducing the risks and trying to do stuff in simulators was quite a sort of interesting thing. And it was interesting video, so I suggest people go and have a look at that. But
didn't they for the Demo 2 mission and Crew 1, didn't they also have that game on the SpaceX website that you could do the simulator where you could dock? Mm-hmm. I wasn't very good at that, which upset me because I really wanted to be good at it. But it's interesting because I wonder, like, especially with, and I know this is like one of those classic things when people go, "Oh, these kids," but like I wonder if kids will naturally like be better at those kind of things in the future, because like it's like you're saying with like NASA and stuff doing that, like you can pretty much do a simulation for like any kind of job now. Like if you're in the military, you usually have simulations where you have to like go and rescue and save hostages and stuff. And then it's the same with like flight school. You're in those simulations and all those kind of things. And like, I just wonder, because like being a kid, you grow up playing video games and doing that kind of stuff more. I wonder if there's anything in that, just because like, for instance, I can sit down with like a flight game and it would take me a couple of hours to figure it out, but I'll get there and I'll be able to play it even if I crash it into the ground. But I'll be able to like at least keep it in the air for 30 seconds. But like if I gave it to my mum, just screaming, and thing would fly straight into the ground, you know what I mean? And there wouldn't even be like the slight curiousness of wanting to learn it. It would just be like, no. I remember getting a Wii when I was about 10 or 11 or something like that, and playing Mario Kart. And obviously that is very like, you're using a steering wheel and turning it. It's quite similar to a car. And like, I would play it with my parents, and like I just picked up, having never used anything like the Wii before. I used to have a PlayStation, but like that was completely new then. Having never played Mario before, and like I could just pick it up and like could go around the track and stay on the track most of the time. And like my parents would play it, like they could play it for hours and they would not be able to do anything despite them being able to drive. Exactly. And like you used to see all the time on the news of like, like when you used to see kids that would like drive off in their grand's cars or like steal their parents' cars, and they'd manage to get like 20 miles down the road, and it's because of what they'd learned in GTA or in their like car racing game and stuff. And I often think that, like, I just wonder, like, the more that we go that way, because even like now, like I don't know about you, but like when you go for like job interviews and stuff, it's like a simulation of a job interview, because it's all online now. It's like you don't actually go there and talk to them, but you have to make sure your top half's nice. You've got a shirt on and you're sitting in your boxers and you're making sure the behind of your room's fine. And you're like, it's like a simulation of an interview.
Yeah.
But it's not the real thing, but it is. Do you know what I mean? And like, I just wonder if kids are just going to get naturally better and better and better at those things.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I think maybe at the moment it's like, not to talk down on people that are younger than us or older than us, but sort of our generation, so like from people aged 20, early 20s up to like 35, I don't know what generation that is, or if it goes across generations, but whatever. Like that sort of generation is like the golden age of people just being able to pick up techie stuff and use it.
Yeah.
And like understand stuff in some ways. Like as I said, like people, my parents are hopeless at it, but like people of our age you could give them anything electronic and they could probably use it.
Yeah.
Like old stuff and new stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas like a lot of younger people, like if you gave them even something like a DVD player, they probably wouldn't have a clue like what it did, because it's like that hardware aspect of things has just vanished. And I think in like 20 or 30 years it'll be even more dramatic than that, in that a lot of things will be automated, a lot of things will be AI driven. And like you said, with like the driving car example, in 20, 30 years time I could see it going like completely the other way, in that kids have no concept of how to drive a car because all of the cars they've ever experienced have been self-driving. And as far as they're concerned, you just get into it and it goes somewhere.
Yeah.
And like if you like drew on a graph, you'd have like all the young people at one end who everything just does everything automatically for, and old people at the other end who sort of what they know is what they know, and they don't have like adaptability to learn other stuff. And then like you have us in the middle who trying to hold stuff together.
Yeah. See, on both sides of that story, that it kind of sounds like a utopian kind of like dream, because you don't have to worry or think about anything because everything's done for you. But it'd also make a really good like dystopian film, just like this idea that everything turns off and everyone's like, what do we do? Yeah. So I was like, quick, turn it back on. It's like, how do we turn it back on? Oh, I don't know. That turns it on, but that won't turn on either. And everyone's just freaking out. Like no one even knows how to like make toast or how to open a fridge because the robot did it.
Yeah, but it's sort of what happens, isn't it? Like my parents, like when I was a kid, like, oh, you need to be able to learn to use an atlas. Like you need to know how to use a road map. Oh, like, well, sat-nav does that. I'm like, I know. Well, what if a sat-nav doesn't work? And like, I would like to have been born like in the near distant future to like see how technology now is in like 100 or 200 years time, to see that sort of stuff. But part of me sort of is quite pleased that I got just on the cusp of stuff becoming completely internet based and like automated, and that I sort of know how to do things.
Yeah, I think that is one thing that I've always found like really funny about like the whole millennial generation, is because like you know, like the old saying, like the grass always looks greener kind of thing. Like we're born at such a weird time that like it's almost kind of like a what's the word? Like imposter syndrome. Like we don't know whether or not we align with the people pre-tech or like post-tech. So like half of our generation is very much like everything is cool. We can do literally anything. Like open-mindedness is key. I can see everything that's going on in the world. I can pick anything up. The world is great. And then the other half is like, oh no, it's causing too many problems. Put it away. I don't even want to use it. I'm sick and tired of what you've got to say. And it's funny because I think like all the other generations, there are obviously like open-minded people and non-open-minded people and techies and non-techies, but it's very weird how like everyone before us, like you're saying, kind of like there are obviously a few exceptions to every generation that people can pick up tech and be absolutely fine, but like the majority, like everyone before us was kind of like not down to clown with it, and then everybody after us is like super down to clown with it, and we're kind of just caught up in the middle of hearing both sides of the argument. But it is a weird one because it's like in the like one breath you have like, especially, I don't know if you ever get this, but like you get told on a regular basis by your family, oh, you shouldn't be on your technology all the time, you should be conversing and then every time I go home they get worse with it. Like it's gone from being like checking your phones for texts now to like the whole family will be on their phone after like a couple of hours have gone, and the niceties have like ended with like meeting and greeting. Do you know what I mean? It's just funny.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what it's gonna be like on like the nightclub streets after lockdown, because everybody's got so like into doom scrolling and being on their phone, phoning people and talking to people. Like, I wonder if when all the clubs and pubs and everything opens back up, if everyone's just going to be sat at tables on their phones and at bars on their phones, or if everyone's going to like fully send it the other way and be like, I'm done with this digital world. I need physical, social interactions.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm getting a bit sick now of Zoom calls and
yeah, I can't wait just to like not have to worry. And obviously we'll always have to worry about like diseases and stuff cropping up, but I'm just excited to like see people that I enjoy spending time with and not worry about like giving them something or feel like I'm breaking the law, because it's such a weird world. Like, you can just be walking down the road now, and if you see someone, it's like either you or them cross. Do you know what I mean? It's like gone are the days where everything's packed. Like, I can't even remember what it's like to be at a gig with all these people like banging into me and everything, because I'm so used to everyone being so far away.
Yeah. Oh,
It's weird.
Anyway, back to simulation theory.
Yeah. So I've only got 2 more on my list before we get onto any of your ones, but one that I thought was quite interesting, and I wouldn't understand how this one gets used, but it was one of the ones that kept cropping up. So apparently we run simulations to understand the relationships with religion and the relationships between religion, but I don't really understand that one.
I've got nothing. I really don't know.
Maybe they just kind of like, it's kind of like one of those like Clash of Clans games. Like they just get people, like they have societies and they run them like Sims with the different religions and see which ones progress either way that they do. I don't know, but I thought that was interesting. And then my final one was weather, and one that was more prominent within weather is earthquake research. Apparently we're doing a lot of simulations in that at the moment.
Yeah, the weather one, I'll go through way back to our episode on chaos theory, but we're getting pretty good at it now. I think I heard it on, I can't remember whether it's a podcast or some news article or something, but we can now predict a 10-day forecast as accurately as we could a 6-hour forecast like 50 years ago or something.
Nice.
Like we're getting pretty good at it, and weather's a good one in that it just illustrates that it is just data and the amount of data that you can process. And as we collect more data and have more models to go on, we get progressively better at doing that. So, but I think what's interesting about it is it shows that we can do it pretty well. But even with all of the resources that we have, and there's some massive amount of computing that goes into this stuff, we are still nowhere near that you could just sort of program up a computer and simulate Earth's atmosphere, Earth's weather system for a year or a decade or something. Like, we are nowhere near that. It's I think that's sort of it's not a problem with simulation theory, but the problem with simulation theory is that it gets very much like, but how would you even simulate the weather in that way? Well, that's just the simulation. The weather is simulated, and what you think of as like really complex is actually just simulated to look complex. There's this like recursive argument of like the simulation is a simulation because it's the simulation kind of thing.
No, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about it like that, because with everything that we've got, we can like do 10 days pretty well. And then imagine like how many planets there are in the universe, and then running them at the same time in respective to their orbits whilst the universe is expanding, and any debris floating in space that could crash into any of those planets. Like, there's so much to simulate. Like, it almost kind of seems like you wouldn't be able to do it. But I don't know. It's interesting, that one. I wonder if like when we get like a better understanding and we get like better breakthroughs with like quantum mechanics and quantum computing, if there's anything in like multiple simulations happening at the same time kind of thing, but it being in one. And like what I kind of mean like that by that is like, you know, like with like quantum entanglement, for instance, like if you do something to one, the other one knows, and that information travels quicker than light. Well, then what if something like that was happening where the simulation is happening at like a quantum level everywhere, and that's why this is really out there now, and it probably makes no sense, but maybe the simulation's happening everywhere at the quantum level, and then it has to happen everywhere at the quantum level for then all atoms in the simulation to decide what their state and position is, so that the simulation can exist. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense, or does that sound really weird?
A little bit.
So like everything has to be simulated where it is, so everything knows where everything else is simulated. And then that falls into like the idea of like the probability field of like it can exist anywhere in there. What happens if that's it? Like if every atom is a simulation, but they all have to be simulated at the same time for the simulation to exist. But now I just sound like you going, so there's a simulation for the simulation, and that simulation simulates the simulation.
Yeah. It's this sort of like rabbit hole of just complexity. Yeah, and at any time, you know, there are obviously people that take this stuff very seriously and have like arguments that are far beyond my comprehension. But a lot of the arguments are just like, well, how does that work in the simulation? Oh, that's just how it's been simulated. Well, okay, that's not very fulfilling answer, is it?
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you.
So yeah,
it's a weird one because there are like so many things as well that are like arguments for and against it. I don't know if you've seen. I think I can't remember his name. It's something James. He's a scientist, and he did a whole book on how the universe is simulated through something that he found in like supersymmetry. But then I was like, isn't that tied to string theory? And I wasn't sure if we actually are still on board with string theory anymore, are we?
That sort of area of physics is...
It comes and goes all the time.
I know least about it. I don't know anything more than the average person on the street. So,
but I watched this TED talk. It was like 49 minutes long, and it basically came down to something in supersymmetry makes everything in the universe binary code of ones and zeros, and that he felt that this was a pretty big like argument for simulation theory. But I was like, but you could do that through human interpretation. Do you know what I mean? Like this is another problem with like humans too, is we love looking for a pattern, and if you get it in your head that you're searching for something, like you're going to go through your day and you're going to see things that kind of like resemble that pattern, and you're going to like have that feeling. Do you know what I mean? Like if you keep making a joke that, oh, I live in a simulation, you like wake up every day and you're like, I'm in the simulation, and then you go down the road and like some guy looks at you weirdly or says hello to you or something, you're going to go like, oh, maybe I am, that's weird. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're searching for it, I feel like you're going to find it. And I feel like the simulation like argument or hypothesis, without going into it too much now, could be like, I think it represents something bigger for like humanity, in the way in the way that we think, in the way that we're curious. I don't think I can't really say without giving my opinion to the simulation theory, but I think it has a deeper meaning than what is on the surface to it, if that makes sense. I think it's interesting, and I think it shows you a human behavior which I think we don't really like study and look at enough, which is like, because I know we study a lot of like how to build simulations and why simulations are good, but the idea of why we would even want to have simulations, like even if you just forget profit or understanding, like this curiousness that we have, I think is also really interesting.
Yeah.
It's
definitely.
good. It's a good underlining element. But have you got anything else that they use as simulations?
So I had a few bits to sort of add. So in terms of uses, the only other thing that I sort of had was from my own background in science was, as I said, we tried to simulate pretty much anything, in particular sort of areas of astronomy and cosmology, quantum research, particle physics. A huge amount of stuff is simulated, and there's whole areas of physics in particular that are built on basically nothing but simulations. And in terms of, I think string theory is actually an example of that, is that there's no actual physical evidence for any of this other than basically the maths works out.
Yeah.
And it's particularly the big stuff and small stuff where at the limits of we just can't do it experimentally. You can't, I know we're getting pretty good now, but you can't map every sort of gas cloud in the universe using telescopes. It's not possible, but you can make a simulation that will do something similar.
Yeah.
And that can sort of, a lot of sort of cosmology to do with like, I forget the name of it now, but like the web and the filaments that sort of evolve throughout the universe and can allude to sort of what happened in the early universe and the Big Bang. A lot of that is based on simulations rather than actual data and experimental evidence. So, yeah, I thought that was sort of my only other use case. The other things I had were sort of healthcare and what we've already covered. But when I was sort of looking at this week's episode, I wanted to sort of look at sort of some of the stuff we discussed from the first week, and in particular was the sort of like idea of consciousness in simulation theory, and this sort of problem of a big question in simulation theory is, okay, if do we assume that simulated things can have consciousness, and let's say we are in the simulation, are we actually conscious, or is it a simulated consciousness? and this is a sort of question that comes up all the time, and it's sort of tied into a brain in the vat sort of hypothesis and sort of thought experiment of, if you had this is again potentially a technology that could come along in the future, is if we are able to extract a brain from someone and pull it in a life supporting machine and hook up electrical signals that simulate the body. So you hook into it the nerves that simulate what you see, and the nerves of what you feel, and what you smell and taste. There's no way for the brain to know that it is not in a person, and almost in a way that is much obviously the biological side of stuff is very difficult and we're nowhere near that yet, but you could simulate an entire universe for someone much more simply than simulating an entire universe. And it sort of tied back to what we said about how you can make a simulation with like render distance, so that you only simulate the stuff that you need to. If you got a brain in a vat, you could simulate an entire person's conscious experience of everything just by some electrical signals of like what it would be seeing and what it would be touching and stuff. That there would be no need to actually simulate anything other than the responses that a person would have throughout their life, which just comes down to electrical signals going in and from the brain. So
just like their conscious like experience. That's a weird one. That's a weird conversation in itself, because you can go off down the route as well where it's like, how do I know you're conscious in my simulation? Maybe you're like, maybe I'm the only conscious being in this simulation and you're all simulated to look like you have consciousness around me.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is that like in this sort of example, is there any actual real way? Like consciousness is like a very internal thing, isn't it? Like, whether you're right or wrong, you can say that you are conscious, but like there's no real way to say that anything else is conscious. Like just because like I'm talking to you now and I can see you and we seem to be having a conversation doesn't really imply any consciousness. It implies that you're responding to me. But like, there doesn't necessarily have to be any like
Yeah.
actual thought or like conscious decisions going on.
Totally.
So yeah, I thought the brain in the vat thing was cool because like that is a way to simulate an entirely conscious person and all of their experiences with nothing more than, oh, they're seeing something now, put 12 volts into them. Oh, they're tasting them, put 3 volts into this line.
Yeah. But then, what would be the purpose of that? Do you know what I mean? Would it just be to because you could probably make an argument that 1,000 years in the future, that's probably the most ethical way for an intelligent being to live, because they're not, they can do what they want, they can have like their freedom, their free will, their independent thought, but they're not wrecking their reality. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you want to go and destroy simulated world, go and destroy simulated world, but you're not destroying Earth. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think from like, you can get pretty horrific with this stuff, but if you, it goes back to like the medical stuff and the philosophy. Like, if you had a brain in a jar that you could give experiences to, like, you could simulate it doing stuff that would not be ethical in the real world. Like, you could simulate, you know, what does a person experience and feel, and how do they react if they were in, you know, a horrific accident, or if they were shown some like deeply traumatic stuff, which you just can't do with real people. But for all intents and purposes, and for what the brain thinks it is a person, there will be like even just a simple problem of like, well, I can look down and see my arms and legs. Wow, that's the only physical thing that confirms that is there is some like signals going from my eyes to my brain saying that I can see it.
Yeah.
And you know, if you manage to completely remove my eyes and just put in some very clever computers that put signals in, then you could do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Hypothetically. So I think I think the brain and jar thing was interesting because it tied up all of this stuff of like, what do we actually have to simulate to simulate something? Can it be conscious? How would we go about it? And as I said, the biology side of stuff, like actually being able to do this, is obviously really, really difficult. But in terms of computationally, it's almost a lot easier than anything else that I can think of. If you said to me, would it be easier to extract a brain and feed it with signals to give it experiences, or simulate an entire universe on a computer, I'd probably go for the brain. So
no, I'd agree. I think that's a very good point.
But yeah, I think we sort of covered everything I wanted to say. Really, so
cool. Well, we'll cut it there, and then for this week, because I know that we've got some stuff for like final thoughts and everything for our final bit on it next week. So we will save that for then. So let's move over to some news for this week. Do you want me to go first?
Well, I can see on your notes, obviously I didn't read them closely enough beforehand. We've actually got one bit of news the same. So I guess we'll start with the Astroscale stuff, and we can both chip in on that.
Yeah. For some reason as well, I've just noticed in that doc my links are back to front for my two things. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to start with that then?
Yeah. So this company called Astroscale, they are creating a system, a demonstration system to practice removing debris from orbit. So just as a very basic, what they're going to do, their first sort of thing that they're going to launch, and they're sort of planning to launch, is they're going to have a servicer spacecraft, which will be a large thing that does the deorbiting, and alongside that they're going to launch a client, which will represent a mock bit of space debris. So they can launch the two together, and then the servicer will chase down the client, capture it, and then release it again, and then they'll do another run and another run. And the article that I've got on the BBC sort of describes it as cat and mouse, and they're going to gradually build up complexity. So towards the end, they're going to have their client, their fake debris, sort of tumbling and falling around and doing stuff that could represent like maybe a satellite that's bumped into something or has been put into orbit incorrectly and has malfunctioned, and they're going to try and capture that and deorbit it. So it looks really interesting actually, and quite well thought out.
Thing I saw on it weighs just under 200 kilograms, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It looks like a little nifty thing, to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
But no, yeah, I think it's cool. Wasn't it? It's with the UK Space Agency, isn't it?
I don't know about the UK Space Agency involvement, but it's being run and operated from a centre in the UK. But it seems to be a commercial technology, and I think it's got some sort of funding body, some government backing or UK Space Agency funding, but they seem to be sort of pushing this to sort of demonstrate that they can do it and plan to actually launch it as a commercial service. So similar to the Ukrainian system that I discussed last week in the news.
Yeah, it says here it's overseen by Catapult, which is a satellite surveillance company.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
But yeah, I think it's really cool and it's really interesting, but I think it's a bit late. Like, we should probably be doing this probably a bit earlier.
This should have been news for episode 1.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think, like, at the end of the day, this is one big satellite being able to deorbit one small satellite, and there's thousands of satellites up there already that we'd have to do this to. And that like, way back in our space debris episode, I said, like, even just like nuts and bolts and bits of paint are like issues.
Yeah.
It's not just satellites that are up there. And also, without trying to be negative, there's a big possibility that this could all go wrong. And if the service had collided into a tumbling client, that would not be good.
Then they have to send another one up to get both of them, and then it collides with that one.
Yeah.
So
like, it could go very, very wrong. But in the article that I've said, it says they'll be up there, and there's a risk they will start to break up, collide with other objects, and make the debris situation much, much worse. Talking about debris in general. So, it looks promising, and I'm glad somebody's doing something about it. But I think we probably need a bit of a bigger solution than just sending stuff up to capture one satellite at a time.
No, that's interesting though. We almost need like just a giant magnet.
Mm-hmm. Big space net.
A big space net.
Mm-hmm.
But so my other bit of news is a little bit off topic to pretty much everything we were talking about, but I thought it was cool, so chucked it in for this week. But I like the title of this article by The Guardian. It's called "For Crying Out Loud, Dutch Scientists Grow Human Tear Glands." And from what I've seen, they've basically created some miniature tear glands that are capable of crying using stem cells, and they're doing this because they're researching into tear-related disorders, which I didn't even know was a thing. But it looks really interesting. They created the first tear gland for a mice, and then they have moved on to human tissue suspended in gel.
Yeah, I have heard about them sort of trying to replicate stuff, but I didn't know they were doing it with tear glands. But yeah, it's another sort of area of medical science where we seem to be moving a lot faster than I think people know.
See, we're being emotionally supportive. When we create the AI conscious robots, they'll be able to cry.
Yeah, great, that's awesome. They'll be able to manipulate us even more.
They'll be able to express how they feel. Imagine that your monitor just gets like a little tear in the corner, and it's like, oh, sorry, have you been on for too long? And it's like, yes, turn me off now. But no, I thought that was interesting. I think it could be cool. I love it when they do like research with stem cells, because when I was a kid, I don't know about you, in school, it felt like stem cells were the answer to everything in biology. You could just do whatever you wanted with them.
Yeah, I remember learning, did a bit of AS level, and every question just seemed to be about stem cells back then. But yeah, it's definitely, because what I'd heard about them doing was sort of using stem cells to treat things like blood cancers and bone cancers, and that they can try and get the stem cells to replicate sort of blood and stuff, so they can almost transplant without having to do a transplant.
Yeah.
Like because it's come from your own stem cells or very similar stem cells. There's no sort of issue of things being rejected by the immune system because it's basically your own tissue. So yeah, this sort of being able to grow things, even if it is a bit weird and it's to your glands, I think is really awesome, and hopefully we'll have some positive impact in the future.
I like the name that they've used for them, organoids. Organoids. Small organs. I like it. But yeah, that's my bit of news.
Okay. My final piece was another bit of depressing news. So this was news that recently the UK government has decided to sort of reduce the overseas aid budget as part of these cost-cutting measures. But as part of that, it seems that a lot of space projects are going to lose funding, and it's a bit of a shame. This article I've got on the BBC News says that the UK Space Agency... Actually, I've got a bit of news about the UK Space Agency. It's under a bit of pressure at the moment. Essentially, you know, this OneWeb thing this is a bit of a tangent, but the OneWeb thing we were discussing, remember I said, like, oh, they seem to want to use it to, like, replicate Galileo and have their own, like, GPS system, but they've bought something which is just like an internet provider. And then the UK military came out and said they were looking at ways to use it for, like, reconnaissance and intelligence and stuff. And again, there didn't seem to be any way that this stuff could be used to it. And there's a lot of sort of controversy and stuff surrounding this. It seems like money's being exchanged between people that maybe aren't that interested in UK space programs. And the UK Space Agency, as the UK Space Authority, sort of wrote a report on this acquisition of OneWeb that was quite critical and said they don't see how it develops UK space capability at all. It seems like a bit of a waste of money. And in response to that, the government has put all these restrictions on the UK Space Agency, and it's like cutting funding, and they seem to be basically stripping it of powers when they do a lot of good work. So I'd suggest people read up on that, and maybe we could discuss that in the future, because I'm not sure that's a good thing. But in any case, in this news story is about sort of the overseas projects that they do. So the UK Space Agency has this international partnership program. It's very highly sought after and very highly regarded around the world for its funding. And they fund, it says here, they funded 43 projects in 47 countries since it was launched in 2016. So these are sort of quite small scale projects. It says the annual spend has been about 20 million. So we're not talking about lots of money here. But as part of the cut to overseas aid, this funding is being reduced. And as a result, 10 projects have been basically wiped of funding that they would have for these sort of space-based activities. And it says in the article that a lot of the activities are sort of looking at space data to tackle sort of human issues. So they talk about human trafficking and flood vulnerability. And then later in the article, there's this big one about this project that uses satellite radar data to track water and try and investigate breeding grounds for mosquitoes, so to do with malaria and things. So using space for like real human good, and it's almost like quite annoying that space gets this big sort of, like I said, I love seeing people on the moon or on Mars, and I'm quite happy for NASA to have all the money in the world. They can do what they want with it. But there is this sort of like political and social pressure of like, oh, why are we bothering to do this? Like, what good comes from it?
Yeah.
And when people do good with it, and trying to prevent human trafficking and reduce malaria, like it's stripped of funding and like never gets a chance to shine. So I think this article was reading through. It's a big loss both for the UK Space Agency and their sort of credibility and what they're involved in, but also obviously the wider sort of international community and scientists in developing nations. So not all good.
Yeah, it's very disappointing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've got nothing much more to say on it other than a bit disappointed, to be honest.
No, yeah, it is. But yeah, anyway, hope you guys enjoyed part 2 of our simulation theory. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, what are you doing listening to part 2? Go and listen to part 1. If you're not following us on social media, go and follow us right now. It is at Infinite Void Pod, and you can keep up to date on when episodes are going live, what the episode topic is going to be that week, and usually we do a couple of cool polls and a few other little things if you want to go and interact with those. And then if you want to hit me up, I'm at Jacob E. Carson, and Matty is at the Matty JMP. And then if you want to recommend a topic or you have something more lengthy you want to send over to us, you can contact us by email at theinfinitevoidpodcast@gmail.com. And we also have a Patreon, which will be down in the description. So go and check that out. We have some cool little packages that you guys can go and check out if you want to support the show. And yeah, we will catch you in the Infinite Void next week for part 3 on simulation theory. Hey everyone, we wanted to take a moment to tell you about our brand new Patreon page.
Yeah, so we've devised a load of new goodies that are neatly packaged across 3 different tiers for you.
Tiers start at £3 and go all the way up to £10 a month.
Just to say, the Patreon is in no way an obligation, and we're going to continue making the podcast as it is freely available across all the platforms. But if you'd like to support us and show your support, you can now.
So yeah, head over to patreon.com/Infinite Void Pod for more information.